everybody. We're here with Hernández Salazar, Guatemalan photographer who was to visit us at Wilma Mary, and coronavirus has kept away, but we are lucky to be here at the offices of the Archbishop, human rights offices of the Archbishop of Guatemala. We will see the installation of his work called Excavation and he will speak to us today about his trajectory as a photographer and his experience recording memories of armed conflict. Okay, so welcome us to Daniel's home.
Yeah, it seems not to work. It's automatic. I wish but we will miss some part. So I'm very glad to be with you today. I felt very frustrated when I got the message from Ben from the college that the trip was canceled. And I also was going to go to Arizona State University this Monday, but today I got an email saying that they suspended everything, so everything collapsed. But I'm lucky and that you are here, and I can share with you part of my presentation, which I hope I will give at the college in perhaps the fall or next year, I don't know. Sorry. I will switch this off, by the way. Okay, sorry. So Betsy and Sylvia asked me to prepare 5 or 10 representative images of my work to tell Guatemala's recent violent story. It wasn't possible for me to just select 5 or 10, so it's 25. and even with 25 it's difficult because it's been too many things happening since the half of the 20th century to this moment. So I'll try to make a resume of that and mix with my work. So first of all, I want to tell you about me. Since I was a child, I had this feeling that something was wrong in Guatemala, and I had this awareness of that something was wrong, that the way society is conceived or built here is unfair, and there are a few people that have a lot, and an enormous amount of people that have only a few of the richness of this country. And so when I grew up, I began to see that I could do something about that. So as an artist, I made the decision to try to document and share with other people what happened in Guatemala. I found out that photography could be the tool I could use in order to have this incidence on the life of my country. So I decided to do it, and I learned a concept in Spain when I visited the Basque country. I met an artist there, and he shared with me a concept which is artivism. I don't know if you've heard it. I think yes, it's a combination of art and activism. So I finally had a name for what I felt I was, because I'm an artist, but I also want to be an activist for human rights and justice in Guatemala. So I thought and I wondered what could be my response as an artist to the horrors of the war and the genocide I witnessed during my 10, 15 years as a journalist here. So I began first to document, because I think to keep a memory and traces of what happened is the most important thing we can do, because memory countries that, like Guatemala or in many countries in the world, is very fragile and has a lot of enemies. The state always, in general, doesn't like to keep memory of what happened in a country, because they're always, they have always a responsibility on what happens in their country, so they don't want to leave traces of the wrong things they have done. So I think that my art could play this role of first documenting, so keeping memory of what happened, but also in a more personal way, try to react and create metaphoric pieces to represent my feelings and a bit of the enormity of the tragedy that happened in my country. And one of the pieces is the one you just saw outside, the angels, but I would prefer to explain them in front of the pieces. So now I'm going to speak a little bit about Guatemala's history. You know, last century we had a small revolution. It's not as big as the French Revolution or the Russian Revolution, the Soviet Revolution, or the Mexican, not even the Mexican, but we had one. In 1944, after 14 years of dictatorship of Jorge Ubico's regime, intellectuals, union leaders, and militaries, which is important, decided to make Ubico go and have a more democratic country, and that is what we call the Spring of Guatemala, and that lasted for 10 years, starting in 1944 and ending in 1954. We had two governments during those years. The first one was Juan José Arevalo. He was an academic. He came back from Argentina, where he was teaching at the university, to participate in the elections, and he won. And his Minister of Defense was Jacobo Arbenz Guzman, who 5 years later ran for president and also won the presidency. But and during the years of our revolution and these two governments, many of the social gains, social security and education and a lot of things that we still have come from those years. After those years, we haven't had any advancement in things like social security or economics that think about the population in general, not just the small groups who always benefit from everything, you know. But the problem was that the Arbenz government tried to implement agrarian reform, which included the lands of the United Fruit Company, you know, the banana company owned by a U.S. UFCO was a U.S. company. And the lawyer or ex-lawyer of the company was the brother of the director of the CIA in the U.S. They were called the Dulles brothers. And so they had a great influence in Eisenhower's administration and convinced him of make an intervention in Guatemala in order to put down this communist regime that was attempting to destroy U.S. interests here. Of course, the oligarchs agreed because they also didn't like the government, because the government wanted them to pay taxes and to share a bit of the richness with the people, and of course the rich persons here didn't want and still don't want, because they are still there. So Arbenz regime fell after a lot of pressure from the U.S. administration. They convinced and corrupted some militaries in order to betray Arbenz. So his regime ended on June 1954. And the picture I'm showing you is the return of the remains of Arbenz in 1995. Finally, the government allowed the family to finally take back the Arbenz remains to Guatemala. He died in Mexico in 1973, I think. some people have told me, some historians told me that he was thinking of coming back to Guatemala, and that perhaps he was murdered because of that. I don't know. It's just a speculation, but who knows, you know? So he died in an accident in his bathroom because the hairdryer fell into the tube and he was electrified. So it's very rare for a military, very clever man to die in this stupid way. But anyhow, he died. And so when he came back, there was a big ceremony and a big welcome from the people. And what you are seeing here is the coffin with his remains getting into the National Palace. He was supposed to be carried by militaries. You see one in the bottom right. Those are cadets from the military academy. But when the funeral procession arrived to the door of the palace, the people, thousands of people, took the coffin and ran into the palace and invaded the palace. They took the palace. It was very, very, very impressive. So for me, this was a key moment in history because we were like starting to reconcile with something very traumatic that happened in '54, which was the interruption of the democratic process of this country. After Arbenz, who I can't agree he was like a left wing or a communist. He was just a progressist, perhaps he believed in capitalism, but in a capitalism more fair and more progressive that included good measures to poor people, social security and everything. But it was easier to put the label on him that he was a communist. More in those days, the McCarthy days, I think, which were very particular in the US. So, with him, I mean, his remains coming back for me was like starting to heal a wound in our history and perhaps restart our path to a better future. It hasn't been the case yet. So after Arbenz regime fell, the repression began, and like 4 years after, in 1960, the repression coming from the government and death squads and the oligarchs, but the oligarchs always hidden behind the militaries, began to persecute people who thought differently, intellectuals, leaders, everyone that didn't agree with the new government. After the government killed and disappeared and made people run away from the country, all the people related with the Arbenz regime and people who were intellectuals had to flee to Mexico or being killed or disappear. Even the Arbenz family and the whole government had to stay inside the Mexican embassy next to the palace for, I think, almost 2 months before getting the permission to go out. And when they went out, the new right-wing government wanted to, how do you say, avergonzar? Embarrass them to the point that they asked all the persons, including ex-President Arbenz, to strip out all their clothes in order to see if they weren't taking something from the country. It was just, to put the boot on them. So this new regime, the liberation regime, started to persecute people who thought differently, intellectuals, teachers, doctors, and the army, instead of protecting the people, was an occupation army. They had a very special squadron called the Caibiles. Caibil is the death Mayan god of the war. And this special battalion has a very special training, very cruel. Most of the officers from this squadron and others went to the School of the Americas in the US to be trained. And this particular squadron is very famous for their cruelty. Just as an example, part of the training of every Caibil was the first day to get a pet, a dog. that would be with them during the whole training. And the last week, they had to take the dog and the knife and open the chest of the dog and take out the heart and eat the heart. So just to give you an idea of the techniques they were learning there. And also, in order to control people, the army and the government organized what they call the civilian patrols. And these men you see there, and women, but more the men, were forced to form part of these paramilitary groups inside their communities, so they could, vigilate their communities from the inside, and denounce all the communists or guerrilleros who could be within them. By the way, the guerrilla movement started in 1960, I think, and the first guerrillas were militaries, young militaries who didn't agree with the new government and the way they were ruling, and they decided to make a protest, and when they weren't heard, they went into clandestinity, and they were the first guerrillas. So it's a lie that the guerrilla movement started because Russia or Cuba came here and put funny ideas in the people's mind. But that's not true. Afterwards, of course, the guerrillas got aid and training from the Cubans, of course, not from the USSR, because the USSR, I think, didn't even knew what Guatemala was. But from Cuba, of course. But in the beginning, the guerrilla movement was a ex-military movement. So coming back to these military patrols, these were very cruel, and also there was another figure called the military commissioner, el comisionado militar. He was a very important person in every community who was in charge of informing the army about the activities of the community, and also pointing out who had to be kidnapped or killed or whatever, because they didn't agree with the government. So this was really, and by the way, the men who participated in these patrols didn't get paid. They were forced, and also they committed a lot of crimes. So that was another way of make even the civilian society complicit of the crimes and the genocide. Now this image is in the final years of the conflict, before the peace signature, but after we started the civilian governments. The exhumation process and the memorialization process began very slowly. So there were exhumations, and this picture depicts widows of men or mothers of men who were killed during the war, who are waiting in front of the National Cathedral for the remains of their loved ones to come out after Mass, and then put them in a truck to transport them to their hometown and to rebury them in dignified manner. And also there were groups of relatives from families of men or women who were disappeared that got organized to look for them, to ask for justice, to say that if they were taken alive, they wanted them back alive, and where were their relatives, their loved ones. So this group was called the Mutual Support Group. In Spanish, it's el Grupo de Apoyo Mutuo, GAM. It's not far from here, the office. And they organized marches and demonstrations every week to ask to know what happened with their families. And this particular demonstration was called La Marcha contra el Olvido, the March Against Oblivion. And when I was revisiting my files to make a book about my work, I found this and realized that there was only one March Against Oblivion. There were not more. Of course, there were more marches, but not with that name. And that those things reaffirm me in the idea of the importance of keeping record of everything and documenting everything, because now for me it's so important to have this photograph or this series of photographs that depict this specific march that was named against Oblivion. And Oblivion here, it's also a way of crushing people's will. The other day I was reading an article about a Chilean, I think, or Argentinian academic who works in Austin, Texas, in the university. And the article spoke about how the establishment represses and controls people by making them wait for everything, by making lines for everything, by making their lives difficult. Because then people finally think, yeah, everything is so difficult. So we don't have to be like, how do you say, exigir? Demand, always. We have to wait, we have to conform, you know. And the article is called The State Patience, from patience, and patient also from paciente, medical patient. So that's another way to control and repress and destroy people's will. You know? And this other image is also from the same mutual support group. This was a demonstration in front of a house where unions had their offices, not far from here, like 3 blocks from here. And I can't remember right now the year, I think it was 78, the army and the secret police kidnapped like 40 men who were leaders of those movements in that house, who never reappeared, of course. And this demonstration was remembering them and asking to know what happened to them. And the woman on the right, her name was Sita Palencia. Sita is the nickname for Jesusa. It's the Jesusita, Sita Palencia. She was one of the founders of this group, and all her life she struggled to know what happened to his son, and he never knew. He died without knowing. And he was included in what is called the military dossier. I don't know if you heard of it, which was published by COLL in 1999. It was made public. And this document is it's a diary that the secret police and the army, intelligence of the army kept. It was a record of people who were kidnapped. And you see in the text, this is just like a detail of one of the pages. In every page there are like 7 or 8 persons, and it's always the same. The name, his photograph taken from his ID cédula. It was a little booklet that we used before the carnet we have now. And then it says, let me see. This member of the Fuerzas Armadas Rebeldes, the Armed Rebel Forces. It was one of the 4 guerrilla organizations. And CNT, Central Nacional de Trabajadores. His alias, he had another name. And he was captured on January 31st, 84. And the address, and then it says he front off, and he was together with this other person, alias Otto, the other guy, and this code 300 means that he was killed, executed secretly on this date, the 6th of, the 3rd of June, 84. Now, this other photograph for me is very important because these are orphans from men who were killed and disappeared on the Father's Day. We commemorate Father's Day on June 17, and this demonstration was organized by the National Coordination of Widows of Guatemala, CONAVIGUA. The president of that group is a woman called Rosalina Tuyuk, a very important leader here, and who also some years ago was a deputy to the Congress, and they organized this very significant march of them, and you see how the child resembles his father in the picture. I cannot document every event, because I no longer work as a journalist, so I do it just for my personal project. So what I do is to choose certain events which for me represent the things I think are important to keep in memory. And this one, of course, was one of them. Also, there have been many massacres, but the first to be famous, to be known that the government couldn't keep quiet was the Massacre of Palaces. It's a small village in the north of Guatemala in Baja Verapaz department. And in the region, there was a mining company and many landowners, but very cruel, It's a very forgotten part of Guatemala. People speak a language called Quechua, which is one of the 23 different languages, Maya languages that people speak here. And but Quechuas have two characteristics. One, they are spread out in a large region of Guatemala and even Belize, the other country now. And also they don't speak Spanish. Now they speak more, but normally they keep speaking their language, not the Spanish. So that isolates them from the development, from the countryside, from the country, because when you go there, you cannot speak with them, and they cannot speak with you. And now it's changing, but in those days it was like that. So I'm telling you this because it's a very isolated place where the army and the rich people thought they could do whatever they want. And one day the community went to the military base to protest against many things that they considered unfair, and the army just started shooting and killed dozens of people. And it was so big that finally it went to the papers and all Guatemala knew about this massacre. So for me it was very important to have photo documents of this. And this is on the day of the 30th anniversary of the massacre. And you see their daughters and sons of the people who were killed. In the middle, you have this woman, and her mother was called Mama King, and she was the principal leader of the movement of those campesinos in that area. So for me, also, it was very important that she and the picture of her and her daughter were in the picture, because that connects you with other parts of the story, and this massacre connects with other parts of the movement. And this other picture beside my angels is the most known picture I ever took. It happened in 1992. On the left, you see mostly women and children from a community in Quetzaltenango. It's a farm called Cajola, and they came to the city asking for their land. And when they arrived to the city, they were received by the police like this. But afterwards, this happened in 1992 when Spain was commemorating the discovery of the Americas, and they had this campaign called Encuentro de dos Mundos 1492-1992. So I took that name, and that's the title for the image. So in English, it sounds more stronger because it's clash of two worlds, 1492-1992. And afterwards, I and other people began to analyze the picture, and you see there are many layers of meaning in the image because, well, of course, first you have poor peasants and security forces, but also you have identity against people that have been ripped out of their identity, because on the right you have also indigenous people. but they are no longer indigenous. They are something else. On the left, you have mostly women. On the right, you have only men. Also, the way the police hold the batons is almost phallic. So it's a total aggression, between men and women. And also you have like color against monochrome. And as a final touch, the helmets of the police, I'm sure are original Nazi helmets from the Second World War. So you have also the coherence of the symbolic with the action. And when I went to Europe to make an exhibition about my work, I visited a military headquarters, and they had a collection of Nazi clothing and helmets. And the helmet was exactly the same, with the same hole and the bolt. So it's an original. I'm sure, I don't think that they bought them because they were Nazis, but in the unconsciousness of the repressive apparatus, I think they saw so natural to use those helmets. And also they were good helmets. But also Guatemala is a poor country. So we had to use used old material from the war. But it's interesting how one picture can have so many meanings. So finally, on December 29th, 1996, the peace process finished, and we had the peace signature. And that night there was a commemoration party in the in the Central Park, right in front of here, and you see the National Palace in the background. And what you're looking here is the president, Álvaro Arzú, with a wounded child from the war, lighting the light of peace. But I don't see any happiness in anyone's faces, because the process really didn't achieve something. The agreements were very compromised. Neither the social society, the guerrillas, the army, the oligarchs agreed with that. Of course, not all the things that each group asked was reflected on the agreements, but at least something came out and the war stopped. But you can see that in their faces. From left to right, you have the Secretary of Peace, who used to be a guerrilla, and for me it's almost like a traitor, because he, after working within the revolutionary movement, changed to cooperate with this president, who in the end I finally accepted and discovered that was a very repressive, autocratic, right-wing person who just died a couple of years ago. He had like a maquillage of freedom and will to help the country, but in reality, the only thing he wanted was something to make more money for him and his group and his family. So on the left is Gustavo Porres, the Secretary of Peace. Then the military there is the General Espinosa, who was the Minister of Defense. But after Arzú left the presidency and became major for a third time, I think, he was in charge of the intelligence office in the underground of the municipality, always working for Arzú. Next, the white-haired man with glasses and red tie, he was the commander of the guerrilla movement. And the ambience in the park was really not happy, There was no reconciliation, but what reconciliation could we have from somebody like Arzú, who didn't really believe in the peace agreements and who worked for the agreements not to be fulfilled? For example, one of the agreements was to have a truth commission sponsored by the UN, the Guatemala government, and the army. They they organized that, and the commission worked. But when the final report was given, and the chief of the commission, a German guy called Christian Tomuschat, who came from the Berlin State University, had to give this report to the country, you know. Who was the one who had to receive it as symbol of the Guatemalan unity? Our president. But our president was Arzu, and Arzu didn't want to receive it. So he was in the National Theater where this ceremony took place, but he didn't stood up and came to the scene to receive the document. He didn't move, and the document was given to the Peace Secretariat, you know. And that for us was a harm against the process, because there was no reconciliation. So this is another image I really like. It's Rigoberta Menchú, you know, the Nobel Peace Prize winner in 1992, who has a very tragic story of her own. He was born in a little village in Quiché department. It's called Chimen, not far from Uspantan, which is another, a little bit bigger village. And since she was a child, he had to come to the city to work in a house as a maid, as many indigenous women did and still do. And his father was, how do you say, not a priest, but he predicador, is like a preacher of the Catholic Church in his community, but also he had a very clear conscience of how the things were, you know. So he fought for the community's rights, and finally he was killed together with a brother of Rigoberta in what is called the Spanish Embassy Massacre. I don't know if you know of that case, but it happened in 40 years ago, 1980, when Vicente Menchú and a group of campesinos came to the city to speak with the president, the Congress. Nobody heard them, so they went to the Spanish embassy. I don't know if the Spanish ambassador knew, perhaps yes, but who cares? I don't think that would be a crime. And the peasants went to the embassy and took peacefully the embassy. And the government reacted by burning the embassy with everybody inside, including an ex-vice president from Guatemala and ex-minister of foreign affairs. 37 people were burned alive. So his father and his brother died there, and his mother and her sister were killed in the fields. So this picture is when Rigoberta, for the first time in 2002, in March, visited an exhumation. She had never ever went to an exhumation, and I was invited because she knows me, we are friends, and she wanted to have somebody of confidence to document that very important moment. And you see that she lighted 4 candles. I don't know, but I imagine it's her mother, father, sister, and brother. And all of a sudden, he did this. He kissed one of the skeletons. These skeletons, we don't know who were. It's not her family, but in a way, I think it was her way of, you know, healing and remembering her family. Now this is again Panzos, the village I told you that was so important because it was the first massacre that we knew about. And this is during the final moments of the exhumation process. You see all the skeletons ready to be taken out from the earth. In the background, you see the community who were witnessing the moment, and these are Maya priests burning incense to honor the persons and also to ask them permission to be moved. And since then until now, there have been, like, I don't know, hundreds of exhumations all around the country, but mostly the largest number of massacres and exhumations is in Quiché department. Now this is the first ossuary that was opened out of 3 in a cemetery called La Verbena, which is in the outskirts of Guatemala City. And in these ossuaries is where they just dump the bones of people that died without identification. They could be killed in the street, or poor people who die in the street, or people who were kidnapped and they were hidden and then just dumped there. So the Forensic Foundation, the Guatemalan Forensic Foundation, who I think you have visited, they did this exhumation and they opened 3 ossuaries. This was the smallest. It was only 7 meters deep. There were other 2, 25 and 35 meters deep. And I think they took out like 50,000 skeletons. And I'm not sure if they found somebody from the war who was disappeared. I think yes, but I don't have the information. But this picture depicts the moment when many relatives who are in many organizations asking to know what happened with their relatives. The US ambassador was on the left side, and other people came to make this ceremony when they started taking out the remains, because it was very symbolic, and for many years we waited for them. Now, after the exhumation process, there is also another step, which is the devolution of remains to the families. And this picture is a family in Nevaj, in the Xil area of the Quiché province, and they were receiving the remains of their relatives. You see in the background boxes, each box contains the remains of one person. And these remains came from exhumations done by the ODA team of exhumations. They don't do it anymore, but in those days they did it, and they gave back the remains like of 100 people in one. They gather the remains until one moment, and then they give it back to the families. And there was this huge mass in Nevaj, and they gave back the remains to the persons. And you see when they received it, I think I have another picture, I'm not sure. The bones are put inside this small coffin, and the family puts them clothing and love things to dignify them, remember them. And this is a clandestine grave in a cemetery next to Comalapa village. Comalapa is very famous because of their painters, and because there was a very strong social movement during the war, so that made the town a target for the army to disappear a lot of people, because there were many people who didn't agree with the government, of course. And this grave, for me it's very important because it's one of the first from which they took samples, the DNA samples, in order to identify persons. And the first persons to be identified in Guatemalan history by DNA from the Civil War were exhumed from these graves. Also, this grave is very particular because this clandestine cemetery was under a military base, the Comalapa military base, and the militaries, as the religions when conquest and invade another civilization, what do? They put their mark on top of the other subdued civilization, you know. So this, you see the how do you say ollas or tiestos or ceramics. These ceramic pots are not from the persons who were disappeared. No, those come from pre-Hispanic times. It was an old traditional indigenous cemetery from, I don't know, the 13th century. And so the military base was installed on top of that sacred place, which is another way of conquering and oppressing a people, So from those graves came out the remains of the first person who was identified via DNA, and I had the opportunity to be there when the sisters of Sergio Linares, the guy whose remains we are looking at, first looked at him after more than 30 years of his disappearance. He also is a case from the military dossier. You have his name and his filiation and the date when he was captured, and we can read here, but there is another date with the 300 code because he was also executed. And for me, this picture and the next one are very important because this is the community coming out from the mass where they got back the remains of their relatives, and after the celebration of the mass, and you see a kind of happiness or liberation in their expressions. At least I see that, because finally they know and they have them back. In this picture, perhaps it's more evident the expression on the woman with the portrait of, I don't know, her sister perhaps, or her mother. For me, she looks like triumphant, They were marching towards the cemetery. And this is the largest burial I've seen with remains of like 100 people. Remember the 3 widows I showed you before? This is the burial procession with the remains of those persons. This is in a very well-known town in Guatemala called Chichicastenango. It's a very touristic place because it's very nice and very traditional, the clothing and the ceremony. So everyone who comes to Guatemala has to go to Chichicastenango, Atitlán, Tikali, and Antigua. But also behind that beauty, there is this so tragic story. And now I want you to put a lot of attention in the dissolving of this image with the next one. This is Ríos Montt trial for genocide. And I tried as a photographer to be out of and document the whole thing, including the press, because for me the press is what I call the eyes of the world. If the journalists do not photograph, document those acts, nobody knows, and it's sad. But if nobody knows, it doesn't matter. So for me, this image is very representative of that. I love to see Ríos Montt so tiny, crushed, and in this time repressed by the truth, And this is the big hall of the Supreme Court of Justice, right, 1 minute after he was pronounced guilty of genocide and charges against humanity. Sadly, 2 weeks after, the Constitutional Court, with the pressure of the oligarchy, reversed the verdict, and the guy died comfortable in his home. But I don't know how comfortable, because I think he also had a conscience, and I don't think he was tranquil with it. If you are able to see La Llorona today, because I think you are planning to see it, you will get a feeling of that, even if La Llorona is a very free interpretation of Ríos Montt's process, but it gives you the feeling. And as always, freedom of speech and freedom of press is something that is always at risk. And I took this picture out of the Supreme Court of Justice when the ex-vice president, Valdetti, was on trial for corruption. But, always repression comes out and shows up, and the press was attacked by the police, And again, I prefer to be out of the scene in order to also register how my colleagues were aggressed by the police. And in a way, I see this picture a little bit of, it resembles a little bit the other picture I show you with the indigenous women on the left side and the policemen on the right side. So after all this, in 2015, we had like a revival of conscience and of the will of people to protest and say that they didn't agree with us, with how the country was ruled, and a kind of like unity, because you saw like indigenous people together with the Ladino people and rich people with poor people, and all demonstrating together against a corrupt president. But the problem was that there was no ideology behind it. It was only that we don't like the guy, you know. But when the guy was gone, also the movement and the will to protest. And that's something very hard here. I say, I don't know if it's possible, this education campaign that the establishment has imposed here has given good fruits, because people are very unconscious. This unarticulated, if you have 50 people in this room, you have 50 different opinions. We are not trained or taught to work together. And I don't think that is by chance. I think it's a project to keep people fighting at each other. Because the guys who pull the strings, they are very articulated and always have been. And the new president we have is a good representative of that kind of people, you know. I don't know if you knew that British, I don't know if the BBC or another chain did a reportage on the coffee that is exported from Guatemala for Starbucks and Nespresso. And the report was about that there were many children, small children, picking up the coffee, harvesting the coffee, in order to be sent to Starbucks. And according to Starbucks, it is forbidden. It's not part of their policy to accept that children would be put like in a forced labor to harvest the coffee they are going to sell. So this reportage was very well done, secretly, and denounced this. Even this guy, the actor, he worked as Batman once. I don't remember his name. Who is ambassador of Starbucks. Even him denounced this. What was the reaction of our new president? He was worried about the bad image of Guatemala in front of the world, and that this was going to be bad for the coffee exporters and bad for our tourism. But he didn't care about the children. And so the model still keeps, you know. So we have to work hard to make people aware of all this, and within this like pessimistic scenario, we have to keep our memory. We have to keep memory alive, and never forget what happened and why it happened. Because if not, it's gonna repeat. You know, we have to pass the real historic memory to the new generations, and we have to fight against these Oblivion official policies that are imposed on us. And with this, I finish this talk. If you have any questions, and afterwards, I would like to give you just a short explanation of these pictures. By the way, the wings of the angel are scapula bones, the shoulder blade bones of an actual victim exhumed from a clandestine grave under the military base of El Chal in Petén department in the north, next to Tikal, for example. So thank you. Pardon?
Over the years that you've been working, how have you seen journalism change here?
If journalism has changed, well, I think now the work by some journalists is better. You know, it really tries to go to the truth, even if there are risks, or because the main newspapers, they depend on advertisement. So those papers are never going to publish anything that puts at risk the revenues. But now with the internet, there are a couple of electronic journals like Nómada and Plaza Pública, for example, who don't care because they get money from other countries or from the Landívar University in the case of Plaza Pública. So they really go and investigate. So that's very good. That's very good. So in that way, I think it's better, but only this kind of media, you know. But the official ones like El Periódico, Prensa Libre, La Hora, they don't really go into the real facts. By the way, many journalists were killed during the war. Yes?
With these photos, how did they get to the audience that you wanted to see?
Pardon?
With these photos that you took, how did you get them to the audience that you wanted to have to see them?
How do I present this to?
Right.
Well, in talks like this, making exhibitions, in a book. I don't know if you've seen. I think you saw this book, published by the UT Press. I also did a very good show in this museum in Belgium. This is the catalog of the museum, where the director of the museum decided to include at the end. It's a Holocaust and human rights museum, but at the end of the museum, he decided to include the angels, because the director told me that for him these angels represent Belgium for him, because during the war Belgium had to cooperate with the Nazi regime, capturing Jews, gypsies, gays, you know, put them in a special prison called Caserne d'Ossang and send them to Auschwitz. And so when they finished the, how do you say, el recorrido, the path of the museum, which has 3 stories, at the end, next to the Auschwitz exhibit, there are the angels. So every guide, when they finish the visit, they tell them that these angels that come from Guatemala, and there is a caption, a placard, explaining that these angels represent Guatemala, the war, the genocide. The first 3 angels that cover their mouth, their eyes, and their ears represent the Belgian attitude during the Second World War, and the 4th angel, it's a call to have a different reaction and now speak out about what happened in Belgium or here. And for me, it's great, because that's what I always wanted. Besides making people aware in Guatemala of what happened to us, it's also for me so important for other countries to know about us and what happened to us and because of whom. And also that people from Guatemala compare and realize of the magnitude of the tragedy that happened to us, that the way we behave now, it's a consequence in a huge part from that trauma, you know. And unless we recognize that, we are not going to heal as a society. So for me, to have these angels in that museum is very significant. Those are the ways. And also I do postcards. Yes?
Could you describe your relationship with the Archdiocese?
Well, the people from here knew me before the Historic Memory Recovery Project finished. So when they finished, they had to publish the report. And they knew me because I was working for the press. And, I think they had an idea of the way I thought and the respect I had for certain things. So they called me and asked me for pictures for the covers of the reports. And when they came to my office, which was like 2 blocks away from here in those days, they asked me for pictures, and I presented them the angels. And he told me, the director, Ronald Ochaeta is his name, and the director of this office and the director of the project, who was a guy called Gutierrez. They told me, and you only have these pictures? And I said, for this, yes, because I knew these pictures must had to be in the covers of that book. And they said, well, okay. And I gave them the picture of the 3 angels, because in those days there were only 3. And for me, it was my way to represent how people here don't want to deal with the past, because they feel complicit, or they don't like, or they are afraid, or whatever reason. In general, Guatemalans don't like to speak about things that bother them. So they went away, and like a week later, they came back and they told me, they phoned me, and they told me, okay, the Remy, that was the name of the project, the Remy team accepted your proposal, so we have to talk again. So they came back to my office, and they told me, yes, we are going to use your angels, but the problem is the report is going to be published in 4 books. And I said, well, no problem. I have to create a 4th angel, but not only because of that, but because more important, you are going to break silence on what happened in Guatemala. So I proposed to create the angel that speaks out. And that's the origin of the 4th angel. And they accepted it. Over the years, after Monsignor Gerardi's assassination, many years after, I learned that the Remy team was Monsignor Gerardi. He was the one who said, yes, we will use the angels. And it is so, it's not funny, it's not the word, it's strange or bizarre or interesting to see how things begin to concatenar, how you say, to come together in a way, like if there would be a plan or, I don't know, a destiny. Because when the books were going to be published, Monsignor Gerardi was alive. The secretary of the then director asked me to use the 4th angel for the invitation card of the ceremony. And I said, yes, of course, it's an honor for me that you want to use it. But I want to ask you something for that, is that I can use the words that Monsignor Gerardi proposed to be the name for the reports, because now it's Guatemala Nunca Más, Guatemala Never Again. But the last 2 names that they were like balancing to choose from were Guatemala Never Again and So That All Shall Know, which were the words of Monsignor Gerardi. And those words stayed forgotten because they didn't use them. But I knew, so I asked the permission to use those words to put as title of the 4th angel. And then, like 4 days after, Monsignor Gerardi is killed. And then I began with the idea of every year to commemorate him, installing the angel in the streets, but the angel has the name that Monsignor Gerardi wanted, and many other things. But it's a long story. That will be my presentation if I finally, I hope, go to Richmond. Yes.
I had a question. You talked about how there were other journalists who were killed and disappeared.
Who, pardon?
The journalists?
Yeah.
Were you at all in danger at one point in time, or?
I don't know. I cannot, how do you say, presumir, presume that, or... I remember that days after the publication, the presentation of the report, and after Monsignor Gerardi's assassination, I lived like 2 blocks away from here, and I got phone calls like at 3 a.m. of people just laughing and insulting me, or ringing my bell also at 2, 3 a.m. in the morning. Nothing else, but a couple of months after, there was a shot in my bedroom from the street. I was looking the television with my family in the living room, and we heard something, and I heard like if a frame with a picture fell to the ground, because it sounds like this. And we went to the room and we didn't see anything, and then when I looked at the floor, I saw pieces of glass, and then what happened here? So I raised the shades, and I saw the broken glass, and when I saw again in the ground, there was the bullet. But we also, as a journalist, an artist, you always have like friends, and I had a good friend who was the public relations officer from the UN Commission for the vigilance of the fulfillment of the peace accords. So I immediately called him, and for me it was very important to talk it over the phone, because it's sure that the intelligence from the army or from the government or whoever could be listening or were listening. So it was good for me, it was protection for me, or I felt it was protection for me to speak it over the phone with a very important UN person, or an ambassador. And he asked me to go immediately to his house, and we went with my partner and we stayed there. And also there was another part of this commission from the UN in charge of the Guatemala in particular, because the other one was for the whole country, and this one was only for the Department of Guatemala. And the director was a Chilean woman, and she also helped me, support me. And like 6 months before, I had an exhibition in El Salvador of this work, of the bones, the angels. And when I came back, I wanted to celebrate my birthday and my mother's birthday, because they happened during my stay in El Salvador. And when we were going to celebrate, we had a car accident. A drunken guy, crushed my car, and my mother died, and I almost died in there this same year. And before I went to El Salvador, this woman from the UN Commission told me, "Are you going to go alone by land in your car with those pictures?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "No way." And she sent a car from the commission who was behind us until we got to the Salvadoran border, and then we moved. But there was always this threat, like floating. They said they investigated the accident in case it was not an accident, but they didn't find any clue or anything. But you never know. Yes, if you asked me something.
Yeah, in Guatemala, what have been all the different reactions to your work?
What have been the reactions to my work? Well, for example, for the street installations, I think you've heard of, I installed the angel in certain points of the city. As I said, the angels represent what Guatemala is, People don't speak. So only people from my family, because we did it in a clandestine way. We didn't say to anyone. We worked in this room, within this table, putting up the posters before we went to the street to put them in certain spaces. But besides us, nobody knew about it, because for us it was a kind of protection to do this in a clandestine way. And the reaction was almost nothing, But afterwards you learn that people say, those are the pictures Daniel did, and those are Hernandez pictures, and relatives from me called me and they told me, "Have you seen your angel in the streets?" Because even my closest relatives didn't knew that it was us that were doing that. But besides that, no. Well, there were important reactions, because three of the places where I decided to put the angel was next to the U.S. Embassy, some military headquarters, and the ones that were next to the military bases lasted like 4 days, and then they disappeared. But the project was, of course, putting up the posters, but then the project was taking pictures of the posters with people in front, with the ambience, because you begin to create a new text with the image within the environment, but also to keep a record of the destruction or disappearance of the angels. And then I felt like the angels disappeared because they began to disappear, because they were destroyed. The first one to be destroyed was next to the industrial bank, El Banco Industrial, which is owned by the richest people in Guatemala. It's interesting to see that it was the first angel to be destroyed. But then the militaries didn't do anything until 4 days after. So I have the picture with the angel in the base, and then without. But you see the mark, you see the absence of the angel. And for me, that's the peace. It's better than if they wouldn't do anything. I was waiting for something to happen to the angels because that was a reaction from which I could learn something. And then, well, of course, there were some articles in the paper, but since I didn't... we sent a press release the night we did the installation to the papers, but I think since we sent that to the press room, I think they didn't get it, We should send it to the cultural section because the other guys are too, too direct to everyday news, no, not something elaborated like an installation. Because with the angel there were no words. It was just a picture, because for me the picture told everything. It didn't need any text, any explanation. It was Hernandez, it was the memory, it was the Truth Commission. It was enough. Yes?
What change do you think is needed to create a space for open dialogue about the armed conflict?
For open?
For an open dialogue, like open conversation.
In the society?
What change do you think needs to happen, and what role do you think that your pieces play in that?
Well, to say that my pieces play a role, it would be, I think it's not to me to say it, but for your first question, I think it's a change of will, a change of mind in society, and mainly from the most powerful people, that they permit, allow this dialogue, because they know they don't want any dialogue, but because they know every dialogue will go against their interests, because they have so much control of everything. For example, again, this new president, who is like I don't know if a servant or a representative of the oligarchy, authorized that the government will pay for the pesticides for the coffee and the sugarcane plantations, which are privately owned. Why do we as people have to pay for that if they get millions of dollars of benefits out of the exportations and selling sugar? So unless these people, soften a little bit the tightness of the control they have on society, and permit that and don't corrupt politicians also, because there is a lot of corruption, of which they are also victims, but they have created it. Unless they permit and support a dialogue, nothing will happen. If the powerful people don't allow that to happen, there has to be something violent. For me, the problem is that our revolution, that's why I always make jokes about it, it didn't finish, it was too soft. It's this problem. Guatemalans always want to be nice and to be how do you say? Estar bien siempre con todo el mundo. How do you say?
Accommodating, always be liked by everyone.
To be liked by everyone. Don't do anything that will bother or get angry anyone. No. Be nice. Always be nice, you know. And with that, you do nothing, because sometimes you have not to be nice in order to achieve certain things, you know. It's like the Mexican Revolution. Some blood had to how do you say, to flow. The French Revolution, don't speak about it. The Soviet Revolution, the US Revolution, you have to fight for it. And here it was like halfway, you know. Perhaps we still have that revolution pending, and we have to fulfill it and to go through this traumatic, huge conflict in order to reorder the society. El Salvador is a little bit better than us, because there the guerrillas almost won the war, almost. And so that gave them more power. Now the problem is that they became corrupt. But at least El Salvador works better, I think. People work more together and they have a more common view of their future. Here it's so difficult, because here it's also a combination of unwillingness from the powerful people, but also that we are like two worlds, the rich world and the poor world, the Latino world and the indigenous world. And also the indigenous world is atomized. I come back again to what I said before, is we are kept separated. Any kind of organization here is not good. It's funny how the words that start with a C, they don't like it, like comunitario, comunidad. It goes to communism, you know. It sounds like comunista, compañero. No, never. It's like, well, in the States there are people who still see communists everywhere. You know, Bernie Sanders is a red guy. It's funny how this mentality is still present. I mean, here it's worse because we are less educated.
It seems like there's a role for what you call art activism.
Artivism, yeah.
Artivism, that can extend beyond national borders, and that perhaps thinking transnationally is important also for change in Guatemala.
A difference now is that the international community is present again here. That's why the NGO's new law has been approved by this president, because this law, what it wants is to put more control on the money that the NGOs receive from the outside, because this government, the oligarchy, the establishment, see the NGOs as insurgents, you know, as people against the system, because they help new ways of thinking, inclusion of LGBT communities, helping people to develop and to get education, and they want to control that, you know. So.
Also, you mentioned at one point issues that seem to affect indigenous rights, but also the environment, el medio ambiente, extractivism, pesticides, that it seems very much connected.
Oh yeah. Yeah, it's like, for me, it's incredible us to pay for the pesticides for the sugarcane farm owners. It's a lot of money, and they make a lot of money out of it. Plus, they contaminate our air because they burn the sugarcane plantations to make it easier to cut the sugarcane. instead of using the right machinery and investing in this machinery to make this procedure more sound to the environment, they burn that. So when they are burning sugarcane in the coast, here we get the smoke. You can. ¿Qué tal, Nelly? ¿Cómo estás? Nelly Rodenas is the director of this office.
Nice to meet you. No, you have to come in. Bienvenidas, bienvenidos, ¿verdad? Bueno, es un honor que estén acá en esta reducción, ¿verdad? Creo que ¿me entienden?
Sí.
Welcome to office.
Podemos pasar a Los Ángeles.
Vamos a ver ahí. Sí, no es que los vinos nos vamos a ok. They have to close.
That's fine, that's good. We'll go to the angels. Thank you.
We are running out of time. So this is the official format for the angels. I will also explain you a little bit of the photographic technique. This is not digital photo, it's analog photo. So this is printed in my darkroom by me, myself. And the pictures were taken with a negative camera, a 6 by 7 centimeters. And the image is constructed with two images. The photograph of the bones, which I took in the Anthropology Foundation, and as I said, come from a clandestine grave in under the military base of COLL, combined with the pictures of this guy who is a model, he's a friend of a friend. I chose him because he looks very like average Guatemalan. It's not 100, for me, it's not 100% Maya, neither 100% Ladino. It's like good mix, but it could be more representative of the Guatemalan people. After I took his picture, the last one, because the first three I took them in, I don't know, June 97, and the fourth one I took it in December 97 or January 98. After I took the second one, 2 months later, he went illegally to the US, and he lives in Los Angeles, which is for me symbolic because the angel lives in Los Angeles. And I don't know his whereabouts anymore. I'm sad because of that. That's a pending project. I have to work on his life because his image became so important for Guatemala's memory. So I combined the two negatives in an enlarger, in an analog way, and I projected that into the silver plate, and then I developed the photograph. I did it in pieces for two reasons. First, because I cannot develop such a large piece of paper, so doing it in parts is easier. But also to have it broken, it's also good to represent the suffering and the breaking of the social tissue and the trauma of the war. And that I wanted to represent it with the nails to install the photo. And well, what else? Yeah, I explained the name and also. So that's it. For me, it's very important that these pictures are here because of the symbolism of the place, but also because it's a semi-public space where more people can see the pictures. There is also another copy, original copy of these angels at the Rafael Andívar University. And also the last one, which is also very important to me, is in the Antwerp University in Belgium, because the director of the museum, the Human Rights Museum, afterwards was elected as rector of the Antwerp University. And he liked so much the angels that they made the university to buy for me another copy of this size, and it's in his bureau. So every time he gives a press conference or has a very important meeting, the meeting happens in front of the angel. So that's it. Thank you. Yes?
Was there a reason why you used that scapula in particular?
Well, this
comes out from a talk I had, a conversation, an informal conversation I had with a friend from the Forensic Anthropology Foundation. We were speaking about bones, and he told me, look at the shoulder blades. They look like wings of birds. And in those days, I had this idea of creating an angel because there was like a vogue in the art world to create angels, you know, feather wings or children. There's a card coming out, I think. So I wanted to do this, an angel, but I didn't want to do another angel like the other ones. So I had this idea, and when I spoke to this guy about the wings of birds, I thought they could be also wings of angels. And in that moment, I decided to create the angels with scapula. I wanted ones with a beautiful, because they are very fragile. And they, gracias. Otherwise the door won't close. Sí. Sí, sí, mejor. Solve the problem. The roots, the reasons for the conflict are still there, almost the same as before. Injustice, unfairness, lack of education. So, and now we are more. So the services and the land and the resources are not enough for the people. And plus, you have an unfair system. People have to go out. If we wouldn't have a better system, that's something Trump should understand. Instead of building walls, he should use that money to help people here to be successful, you know, and educate. It wouldn't go. Why? Why would I like to go out if I would have enough to live and to be happy here? There's no other reason than that we cannot live here. Me, yes, but other people don't.
So